Living in a world where your entire dating pool fits inside a single banquet hall, and half of them are your cousins. Welcome to the royal courts of Europe, where crowns were heavy, expectations were suffocating, and the family tree often looked less like a tree and more like a tightly woven shrub. For centuries, royal blood was treated like a rare vintage wine. Precious, protected, and absolutely not to be mixed with the unrefined peasants who made up the rest of the population. And so, in their quest to keep power tidy and bloodlines pure, European monarchs created something entirely different. Generations of families who shared way too many grandparents. Inbreeding wasn't an accident of history. It was a political strategy. Marrying outside the family meant alliances shifting, borders wobbling, and untrustworthy strangers suddenly having a claim to your throne. So instead of reaching outward, kings and queens reached sideways, or diagonally, or in some cases, alarmingly downward on the family tree. Draw up a royal genealogy chart from the 1500s to the 1800s, and you'll quickly notice everyone seems to be looping back into the same dozen names, like a royal version of déjà vu. But the consequences of these choices didn't stay hidden behind palace walls. Over time, patterns emerged: physical traits, peculiar personalities, and health issues that repeated across branches of various dynasties. Some rulers were born with features so distinctive they became symbols of their houses. Others struggled with fragile health, unpredictable temperaments, or strange quirks that the public whispered about for generations. What looked like royal blessing on the outside often came with a quiet, inherited cost on the inside. None of this unfolded in a dramatic horror movie burst of madness and deformity. It wasn't a grotesque spectacle, it was something subtler. A long, slow accumulation of small genetic risks, doubled and redoubled with each cousin marriage. Traits that would normally get diluted stayed concentrated. Weaknesses that should have dispersed instead circled endlessly inside the same gilded corridors. The result was a kind of dynasty-wide echo, where the same features, illnesses, and eccentricities kept returning in new monarchs, like reruns of an old show with a slightly updated cast. And yet, through all of this, the royal machine kept turning. These were not sad, ghostly figures locked in towers. They were powerful rulers shaping continents, commanding armies, influencing religion, and rewriting history. Their choices, romantic or otherwise, didn't just affect their own children. They affected wars, treaties, borders, and entire peoples. The story of inbreeding in Europe's royal houses is not just a tale of genetics gone sideways. It is a story about ambition, fear, tradition, and a stubborn belief that bloodlines mattered more than biology ever intended. Tonight, we're stepping into that world, the candle-lit palaces, the whispered family scandals, the fragile heirs, the political marriages that looked perfect on paper and disastrous in practice. This is the long, twisting story of what inbreeding really did to European royalty, and why it continued for so long. If you were a royal child in medieval or early modern Europe, your life began with a celebration and a contract, usually in that order. The moment you let out your very first cry, a room full of nobles and courtiers already had ideas about your future. They weren't thinking about your first steps or your favorite toy. They were thinking about what strategic cousin you would be married off to one day. Your cradle wasn't just a cradle, it was a political chessboard. Your birth wasn't just your own. It was a move in a centuries-long game where kingdoms, alliances, and an unfortunate number of genetic traits were shuffled like cards. You didn't get to choose your spouse. You didn't get to choose your future. In fact, you barely even got to choose your own personality. That was shaped by tutors who expected you to mirror centuries of royal tradition, which is a polite way of saying, do exactly what everyone else before you has done. A dynasty wasn't merely a bloodline, it was a brand. Generations of rulers tried to keep that brand consistent, predictable, and comfortably familiar. The easiest way to do that? Marry within the same small social circle so no one rocked the boat too hard. Unfortunately for you, that social circle was essentially the European equivalent of one extended family reunion that never ended. The reasoning behind all this wasn't entirely foolish. For rulers, the world was a dangerous place. Betrayals brewed faster than tea. A foreign bride might bring beauty, charm, lands, and alliances, but she might also bring a new influence that threatened the balance of power within the court. A noble with too much ambition could use marriage as a foothold to claim something that wasn't his. A foreign prince might secretly support a rival faction. In a world where your own cousins occasionally plotted to overthrow you, inviting outsiders into the royal lineage felt like opening the gates during a siege and hoping for the best. So, cousins it was. Second cousins, first cousins, double cousins, cousins with enough overlap in the family tree that their DNA could practically send holiday cards to itself. For most royals, this wasn't even considered strange. It was tradition. And tradition had a way of making even the oddest practices feel perfectly ordinary. Children grew up expecting it. Parents accepted it. Entire courts operated under the assumption that marrying outside the family was essentially the equivalent of asking for a civil war. But there was an unspoken reality that everyone politely ignored. Small circles eventually get smaller. Over the centuries, as dynasties intermarried, the number of acceptable partners shrank like a puddle in the sun. By the time you reached the 1500s, European royalty was a tightly knitted web where nearly everyone was related to nearly everyone else. If you traced family lines long enough, you didn't end up discovering distant ancestors. You discovered your own great-grandparents making repeat appearances. Still, the wheels of royal matchmaking kept turning. Behind every marriage treaty were diplomats with tired eyes, scribes with aching hands, and monarchs who acted as though marriage was less an emotional bond and more a shipping arrangement where humans were the cargo. Two kingdoms had a disagreement? Marry their children. A treaty needed reinforcing? Marry their children. A shaky alliance required a reminder? Marry another set of their children. It was diplomacy by genealogy, and it worked, until it didn't. To understand how these marriages affected real lives, picture a young royal raised from birth knowing whom they would marry. They might be told stories about their future spouse, good stories, usually exaggerated. He is virtuous, she is elegant. No one mentioned the awkward detail that the future spouse also happened to share a grandparent or two. Royal children often met their future partners like one meets someone at a business meeting. Polite nods, stiff posture, ceremonial introductions. Behind the scenes, adults whispered about dowries, lands, and political leverage, while the children exchanged the kind of glances two strangers give each other when forced into team projects they didn't sign up for. And so it continued, generation after generation. The royal courts weren't oblivious to the health problems that sometimes appeared. They understood that certain traits persisted across the family line with unsettling consistency. But their loyalties weren't to biology, they were to lineage. They believed blood held power, sacred, ordained, irreplaceable power. To mix it freely with the masses felt like diluting that power, even if doing so would have been the healthiest choice. Instead, they managed the consequences as best they could. Fragile heirs were wrapped in layers of protection. Children with weak constitutions received physicians who tried innovative and often wildly ineffective remedies. A prince with a temper was dismissed as strong-willed. A princess who fainted often was delicate, and a noble who couldn't quite keep up with political discussion was thoughtful. Euphemisms became survival mechanisms. If a trait seemed too obvious to excuse, the court simply stopped talking about it altogether. Silence was easier than questioning centuries of tradition. The strange part is that these families still projected strength. From the outside, they seemed unshakable. Tall castles, glittering crowns, endless ceremonies showing off the magnificence of royalty. Yet, behind the velvet curtains, there were quieter stories. Stories of children born too weak to survive infancy. Stories of rulers whose minds dimmed too early. Stories of monarchs whose physical features became symbols of houses that had been marrying in circles for far too long. But these stories rarely left the palace walls, and when they did, they traveled as rumors, softened by distance. Imagine standing in those courts. The smell of candle wax lingering in the air. The polished marble reflecting portraits of ancestors who all look suspiciously similar. The musicians playing gently as nobles glide across the floor in robes heavy enough to qualify as exercise. This world was beautiful, but it was also confined. Confined by tradition, by fear, by the belief that royal blood must remain untainted at all costs. And in that confinement, in that narrowing circle of acceptable spouses, the seeds of countless dynastic problems were planted. For many royals, their destiny was always pre-written. They weren't merely born into families. They were born into roles, scripts, and expectations defined by centuries of political necessity. Even their genetic makeup was shaped by decisions made long before they existed. They carried the history of their dynasty not only in their titles, but in their blood. The past lived inside them, literally, in ways no one at the time fully understood. Yet none of this stopped them from believing wholeheartedly in their own system. They were raised to see their bloodline as special, their ancestry as noble, their traditions as unquestionable. To step outside those boundaries was to risk chaos, instability, or worse, public scandal, that enemy of all royal households. So they continued the pattern, confident that loyalty to family meant loyalty to the throne. And as generation followed generation, the consequences accumulated quietly but steadily, leaving behind a trail of peculiar genetics, fragile heirs, and rulers whose personal challenges shaped entire eras. In this world, power meant access to everything except choice. And for European royalty, that lack of choice created a legacy that shaped not just their lives, but the history of the continent. Inbreeding wasn't just a quirk of royal storytelling, it was a fundamental part of how dynasties built and maintained their influence. And the results, subtle and slow building, would ripple out for centuries. If you wanted to understand the true mechanics of royal inbreeding, you wouldn't begin in a grand throne room or a glittering ballroom. You'd start in the quieter spaces, the private studies where kings signed treaties, the council chambers where advisors whispered strategy, and the dim corridors where servants carried messages back and forth like nervous bees. Because the decisions that shaped Europe's royal bloodlines weren't made at weddings or coronations. They were made at tables cluttered with maps, letters, and the soft scratching of quills that would quietly determine who was allowed to marry whom. Politics, more than romance or biology, was the architect of these dynastic webs. A king might stand proudly at a balcony, waving to crowds that adored him, but behind the scenes, he often spent his nights poring over genealogical charts as if they were battle plans. In many ways, they were. Borders could be fortified with stone walls and armies, but nothing secured a kingdom's future as efficiently or as dangerously as marriage contracts. A well-timed union could stop a war before it started. A poorly chosen one could ignite a conflict that lasted decades. Imagine a ruler studying a list of potential spouses for his heir. He wasn't looking for soulmates. He wasn't even looking for compatibility. He was looking for leverage. Did the bride come with a dowry of strategic land? Would the groom bring influence over a major trade route? Would this marriage halt a rival family's expansion? These questions mattered far more than the fact that the bride and groom might share the same set of grandparents. Genealogy was a currency, and like all currencies, its value depended on scarcity. The fewer eligible royals there were, the more fiercely they were traded. And so, royal matchmaking became a kind of diplomatic art form. Ambassadors traveled across Europe with portraits tucked into their sleeves, ready to present them to foreign courts like prized merchandise. These portraits, often embellished by hopeful painters, bore little resemblance to reality. A future bride might look ethereal in paint and decidedly ordinary in person. A groom might seem noble in his commissioned likeness, but far less impressive once he opened his mouth. Still, everyone played along. It was the idea of the marriage, the alliance it represented, not the accuracy of the artwork. But beneath these layers of strategy, there was always a quieter ripple of worry. Physicians and scholars sometimes whispered about the unusual number of sickly heirs, or the repeated family traits that seemed to grow stronger with each generation. They didn't have the language of modern genetics, but they had eyes, and they noticed patterns. A long jaw, a narrow chest, a recurring frailty, a tendency toward melancholy, these were discussed in discreet circles, where servants pretended not to hear, and physicians cautiously couched their concerns in respectful terms. No one wanted to be the person who suggested that royal blood was perhaps too pure for its own good. Still, the whispers didn't reach the places where decisions were made. Kings and queens were busy wrestling with matters they considered far more urgent: rebellions, taxes, rival dynasties, and the occasional plague to keep things interesting. Biological consequences felt distant, slow-moving, and easy to ignore. Politics demanded immediate solutions. And so, year after year, treaties were sealed with marriages between cousins, second cousins, and even closer relations when options ran thin. Inside the palaces, these marriages created an atmosphere that balanced elegance with a strange, quiet tension. Courtiers learned to flatter without revealing too much. Artists painted portraits that emphasized noble features and softened the less flattering ones. Tutors taught royal children that their lineage was a gift, even as they kept careful watch over the child's health. And the children, born into this gilded environment, rarely questioned anything. They didn't know what life was like outside the palaces. They didn't understand that other people grew up choosing their spouses, forming friendships without political weight, or marrying partners who weren't chosen with a compass and a diplomatic handbook. Growing up royal meant growing up under the magnifying glass of history. Every trait you possessed was noted, whispered about, analyzed. If you were unusually intelligent, people wondered which ancestor you inherited it from. If you struggled to learn languages, they wondered which side of the family contributed that challenge. If you fell ill easily, there were hushed conversations behind closed doors about delicate constitutions and familial tendencies. A cough might trigger panic. A fever could summon half a dozen physicians armed with conflicting remedies and the sort of potions that would make modern viewers wince in sympathetic discomfort. And through all of this, the idea of marrying outside the royal pool remained unthinkable. Marrying a commoner was more scandalous than any genetic risk. A noble might be tolerated, a foreign hero admired, but marriage? Absolutely not. That kind of romantic rebellion was the stuff of troubadours and tragic legends, not the reality of dynasties whose entire existence depended on carefully curated bloodlines. For better or for worse, royalty believed that their lineage set them apart, even if that separation came with a price. Occasionally, though, reality intruded. A fragile heir would struggle to survive childhood. A young prince would collapse unexpectedly. A princess might carry an illness that shadowed her entire life. These events didn't go unnoticed, but instead of prompting change, they were woven into the family's mythology. A frail child was a symbol of divine testing. A troubled ruler was weighed down by the burdens of destiny. Every weakness became something poetic, something noble, never something preventable. Meanwhile, the political machine continued its steady grind. Marriages were arranged years in advance, sometimes when the children involved were barely out of their cradles. Diplomatic letters fluttered between courts, filled with flowery assurances about alliances and shared future prosperity. But beneath the ornate language, the reality was plain. Europe's royal families were marrying into the same limited circle, generation after generation, creating a loop of political necessity that tightened with each passing century. To understand how seamless this felt to them, you only had to watch the life of a young royal unfold. Their education was designed to reinforce tradition. Their interactions were carefully monitored to ensure they didn't grow too fond of anyone unsuitable. Their playmates were cousins, their tutors, chosen from noble families with impeccable loyalty records, their world a small, controlled orbit, where marriage outside the family seemed almost unimaginable. In such a context, marrying a cousin wasn't strange. It was normal, expected, practically routine. Of course, the consequences didn't stay hidden forever. Over time, certain houses developed distinctive physical traits that artists sometimes exaggerated for drama, only to discover those exaggerations weren't far from reality. Some dynasties became known for their strong jaws or their elongated limbs. Others found themselves plagued by recurring diseases that no physician could explain. And still, the pattern continued. If anyone in those courts had paused long enough to step back, take a breath, and truly examine the bigger picture, they might have noticed the problem growing like ivy around the castle walls. But tradition is a powerful force. It wraps itself around people's minds, convincing them that stability matters more than innovation, that purity matters more than practicality, and that the way things have always been done is the way they must continue. And so, marriage after marriage, generation after generation, Europe's royal families wove themselves into an increasingly intricate tapestry, beautiful from afar, but fraying quietly at the edges. It would take centuries for the full consequences to unfold, and even longer for people to acknowledge them openly. But within these early chapters of royal history, the pattern had already been set. It was only a matter of time before the genetic threads began to tangle. If you wandered through the royal courts of Europe during their golden centuries of power, you would notice something peculiar long before anyone said a word about inbreeding. It wasn't the clothing, although the elaborate brocades and embroidered velvet could easily distract you. It wasn't even the architecture, though the towering halls and endless passageways made you feel like you had stepped inside a labyrinth designed by someone who had never once asked, "Is this too much?" No, the real clue lay in the faces. The portraits applauded as masterpieces, carefully displayed on walls taller than most commoners' homes. At first glance, you'd think these portraits were simply stylistic. The long noses, the pronounced jaws, the eyes that seemed ever so slightly sunken or narrow. Maybe the painters had a flair for exaggeration. Maybe long-faced chic was fashionable in aristocratic circles. But then you would walk into another palace, hundreds of miles away, commissioned by a completely different royal house, and see the same faces staring back at you. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It wasn't even coincidental. European royals were, quite literally, starting to look alike. The same handful of family lines had been cross-looped, rerouted, folded, doubled back, and spliced together so many times that the visual similarities became impossible to ignore. The paintings seemed to whisper a story no one wanted to read aloud. Still, people pretended not to notice. After all, who would dare question the divine blood of kings? Art critics would mutter phrases like strong features or noble profile, while courtiers tactfully avoided mentioning that half the royal portrait gallery could pass as siblings. This visual sameness wasn't limited to art. When foreign dignitaries arrived at court, their private letters home sometimes included diplomatic but unmistakable phrasing. A Spanish ambassador might write, "The prince bears a striking resemblance to his uncle." A French duke might remark, "Her Majesty has the distinct features of her illustrious house." Everyone understood the code. It meant the royal family looked like the royal family, and the royal family, for better or worse, kept recycling its own reflection. Behind the scenes, physicians noticed too. They weren't modern geneticists, but they were observers. And in their journals, they often documented recurring traits with cautious, softened language. They described jaws that grew prominent, skin that bruised easily, hearts that labored, and bodies that responded poorly to fever. They couldn't diagnose the root cause, but they recognized patterns that repeated generation after generation. The puzzle pieces were there, but the picture they formed was too politically inconvenient to acknowledge. Yet these traits didn't appear overnight. They accumulated slowly, one cousin marriage at a time. A royal bride might bring a mild hereditary quirk into the family, but when paired with a groom sharing that same quirk because their great-grandparents were siblings, that trait didn't fade, it intensified. And when their children married back into the same small pool of relatives, it intensified again. It was like taking a faint pencil sketch and tracing over it repeatedly until the lines became bold, unmistakable, and impossible to erase. Still, the royals never saw themselves as victims of their own traditions. They clung to the belief that their blood was exceptional, blessed, sacred, chosen. Any physical oddities were seen as quirks of lineage, little badges of identity. The famous Habsburg jaw, for instance, wasn't viewed as a warning sign. It was a symbol of dynastic pride. People wrote about it with the same reverence modern enthusiasts have for collectible antiques. When a prince was born with that distinct jutting chin, the court saw it as proof of heritage. No one dared say aloud that this heritage came from multiple generations of marital decisions that had all stayed within the same shimmering but shrinking circle. Court gossip, of course, was less polite. Servants who saw the royals up close whispered among themselves with a mix of awe and concern. They noticed the little things, the difficulty a prince had chewing, the way a princess fatigued quickly after walking down a long corridor, the tutors quietly adjusting lessons because the heir seemed to struggle with topics others learned easily. But these whispers stayed firmly below stairs. They were never meant to reach the ears of those who planned the next royal wedding. It wasn't only physical traits that repeated. Personalities echoed through generations as well. Melancholy was common, though it was often described as thoughtfulness or royal introspection. Moodiness, impulsiveness, or social difficulty were chalked up to the burden of leadership. Never mind that many of these heirs weren't yet old enough to be burdened by anything more serious than memorizing the names of their ancestors. The palace tutors knew better. They saw how certain tendencies ran through the family, like threads in a tapestry no one could unweave. Royal caregivers often learned to manage these traits with meticulous care. If a young prince was prone to emotional outbursts, he was surrounded by calm, attentive mentors. If a princess had fragile health, entire wings of the palace were reorganized to give her quick access to warmth, physicians, and herbal remedies. In royal families, even genetic challenges were cushioned by wealth and staff. What might have been debilitating in a commoner's life became manageable, hidden beneath layers of silk, servants, and ceremony. And yet, the challenges still shaped the course of history. A sickly king might struggle to lead, leaving power to advisors or regents who weren't always trustworthy. A fragile heir could spark succession crises that shook entire nations. A ruler whose temperament shifted unpredictably might make decisions that destabilized alliances or provoked unnecessary conflicts. The personal became political because in monarchies, it always did. A single individual's health, mood, or mental clarity could determine the fate of millions. What makes all of this particularly haunting is how preventable it might have been. Even a modest expansion of the royal marriage pool, just a few more unrelated families, could have softened the consequences dramatically. But tradition was stubborn. Monarchs feared losing power far more than they feared losing genetic diversity. And so they kept drawing from the same well, century after century, even as the water became increasingly murky. If you spent long enough in a royal court, you would notice that the line between ceremony and silence was razor thin. The court celebrated births with fireworks and bells, yet whispered anxiously within days if the newborn appeared too frail. They held parades for coming-of-age ceremonies, but behind closed doors, physicians watched the young heirs for signs of the same hereditary challenges seen in their ancestors. But the public never heard these things. To the outside world, the royals were flawless, radiant symbols of God's will. Their portraits were retouched. Their health was guarded as state secrets. Their quirks were framed as noble eccentricities. Yet everyone inside the palace walls knew the truth. The royal families were both powerful and vulnerable, both privileged and fragile, both elevated by tradition and trapped by it. The inbreeding didn't erase their intelligence, their ambition, or their political prowess. Many royals were brilliant, charismatic, or deeply dedicated to their realms. But their biology carried a weight they didn't choose, a quiet inheritance from centuries of choices made in council chambers lit by flickering candlelight. Sometimes a rare royal would break the cycle. They'd fall in love with someone outside the expected list of suitable matches. They might defy advisors, threaten the stability of alliances, or even risk public scandal. But these stories were the exception, not the norm. For every rebellious romance that made its way into legend, dozens of princesses and princes were married off according to plans that had been written before they could walk. And so the royal courts continued their delicate balancing act. They clung to tradition for security, even as that same tradition slowly knitted together the traits that would define their lineage. They built histories full of glory while quietly living with the unseen costs. The effects wouldn't fully unfold for generations, but the foundation was already set in the bone structure, in the health records, in the whispered concerns of court physicians, and in the portraits were the same angles and silhouettes repeated across centuries. The royals weren't blind. They simply believed that their world, gilded, ancient, and dignified, was more stable if it remained predictable. And in their quest to keep power concentrated, they chose familiarity over genetic safety, tradition over change, and cousins over commoners, a choice that would echo through their bloodlines long after the candles in their halls had burned out. For a long time, the royal courts of Europe carried themselves with a kind of serene denial, an almost mythic belief that their bloodlines were invulnerable simply because they were ancient. It was a comforting illusion. The idea that centuries of intermarriage might be quietly eroding the very foundations of their families wasn't something anyone wanted to acknowledge. But the truth has a way of seeping in through the cracks, especially in courts where gossip was as common as breathing. By the mid-1600s, whispers were starting to gather around certain royal children. Small comments exchanged behind feathered fans, murmured in private chambers, never to be spoken aloud in the presence of a monarch. A prince who struggled to walk properly, a young archduchess prone to seizures, a cousin whose mind seemed to drift into strange places no tutor could reach. No one dared say it directly, of course. Blaming inbreeding would have meant blaming the royal houses themselves, blaming tradition, policy, legacy, everything they believed held their world together. So instead, people blamed illnesses, curses, bad luck, childhood weakness, or the will of God. Anything but the truth. Inside the palaces, the signs were clearest among the children. Governesses noticed it first because they spent the most time with them. They saw the moments when a royal baby's head shape didn't quite match that of their siblings, or when teeth grew in strange, uneven ways that no natural diet or early childhood condition could really explain. They noticed how certain children tired quickly, how simple tasks became exhausting, how some seemed trapped behind their own bodies, struggling to keep up with the expectations placed upon them. Still, nurses, tutors, and attendants said nothing. Their entire livelihood depended on silence. And royal physicians? They were trapped in an even tighter bind. Their job was to fix the royal body, not question its origins. Many knew what was happening, but a truth unspoken is easier to tolerate. They hid behind vague medical terms: constitutional frailty, hereditary sensitivity, a delicate nature. Elegant phrases for a problem that everyone was too afraid to confront. Behind closed doors, the monarchs themselves were not blind to what was unfolding. They saw their children struggling. They heard the unspoken comparisons: why this child thrived while another lagged behind, why one daughter was robust and sharp-witted while her brother stumbled through his lessons unable to focus. Kings and queens would sit in private long after the Latin tutors and royal midwives had gone to sleep, wondering quietly, never aloud, if this was the price of keeping bloodlines pure. And yet, even as they saw the signs, they kept signing marriage contracts. They kept binding their children to cousins, nieces, and nephews, because every decision came down to a single priority: power must not leak outside the family. A child's well-being, however tragic, could not compare to the stability of a throne. In many ways, the quiet suffering of royal children became the backdrop of palace life, something so common that people stopped questioning it. The unusual facial features, the difficulty speaking, the fragile bones, the unpredictable fits of illness, none of it shocked anyone after a while. These symptoms were treated as simply part of royal childhood, like learning court etiquette or mastering a foreign language. But beneath the golden ceilings and candlelit halls, there was a growing sense of dread among those who served closest to the throne. They could see patterns forming, traits repeating, conditions deepening, weaknesses becoming hereditary rather than individual. With every generation, the consequences grew a little sharper, a little harder to ignore. And as the 17th century moved forward, the cracks within Europe's most powerful families widened. What had once been rumor was becoming reality. The royal bloodlines were no longer just symbols of divine right. They were fragile, vulnerable, and increasingly burdened by the legacy of their own choices. No one said it aloud, not yet, but everyone could feel it. The lineage was starting to bend, and soon it would begin to break. The truth about European royal inbreeding was never something whispered in public. It thrived in the quiet, unspoken spaces between courtly etiquette and ceremonial ritual. As the 17th century progressed, the effects of generations of closely intertwined bloodlines began to become harder to ignore. Courtiers, physicians, and even monarchs themselves noticed subtle patterns repeating in every palace, yet tradition demanded that they look away. To openly admit the consequences would have been sacrilege, an attack on the sacredness of dynastic purity. And yet, in the shadows of castles and royal residences, the truth was impossible to conceal entirely. Royal children were often the first and most visible signs of trouble. They were born into a world that demanded perfection from birth, and anything less was always a matter of speculation or careful euphemism. When a baby prince struggled to nurse, when a young princess experienced fevers that refused to abate, or when minor deformities appeared in the shape of a jaw or the slope of a shoulder, it was quietly noted and promptly hushed. Families who had been celebrated for centuries as paragons of power and beauty could not afford the embarrassment of imperfection, so the imperfections were hidden beneath layers of silk, ceremony, and discretion. Physicians were caught in an impossible position. They understood that many of these issues were hereditary. They had observed the same traits cropping up repeatedly across generations. Some had even documented these patterns in private journals, describing the family tendencies with careful detachment. But they could do little more than offer potions, leeches, or carefully prepared diets to manage the symptoms. The root cause, decades of repeated intermarriage within the same noble circles, was untouchable. Suggesting it aloud would have been political suicide. Instead, they mastered the art of polite silence, offering vague reassurances to anxious parents while knowing full well that the problem was not one that could be solved with a tincture or a tonic. The royal families themselves were trapped by circumstance and by ideology. From an early age, monarchs were educated to believe that bloodlines were everything. Their tutors, often members of the nobility themselves, emphasized the sanctity of lineage as though it were divine law. Power, prestige, and even the survival of kingdoms were thought to depend on keeping blood pure, and so marriages were arranged with ruthless precision. Cousins, second cousins, and sometimes even closer relatives were matched with one another to preserve both property and influence. Alliances were prioritized over health, and the subtle signs of genetic fragility were dismissed as insignificant compared to the strategic gains that a marriage contract could secure. Despite their wealth, privilege, and the protective walls surrounding them, the children of these unions bore the weight of history in their bodies. Some were frail, susceptible to disease, or prone to developmental challenges. Others inherited visible traits that had become almost emblematic of their dynasties: elongated jaws, protruding teeth, or distinctive facial asymmetries. These features were sometimes celebrated in portraiture as marks of noble distinction, though they were also the unspoken evidence of a long series of marriages that had concentrated the same genes over generations. Every time a new generation was born, the patterns repeated, sometimes subtly, sometimes unmistakably. The psychological and social effects were equally profound. A royal child growing up in a gilded cage, aware of both their exceptional heritage and their physical limitations, faced pressures that would be unimaginable to ordinary people. Tutors and courtiers would carefully guide behavior, but the child was constantly evaluated against standards set not by individual merit, but by dynastic expectations. An emotional outburst might be interpreted as temperament befitting a king or queen. A display of intelligence could be lauded as precociousness or even cunning. Meanwhile, any weakness, whether mental or physical, was quietly noted and stored in the minds of those who would later advise, control, or manipulate the young ruler. Marriage negotiations, too, began to feel increasingly constrained. With each generation, the pool of suitable candidates shrank. Royals had to consider not only political alliances and dowries, but also genetic compatibility, though this was not recognized explicitly at the time. Instead, they relied on patterns, intuition, and long experience, often selecting spouses who were sufficiently familiar in blood and behavior to ensure the dynasty's continuity. The irony was inescapable. In trying to preserve the strength and sanctity of their lineage, they increasingly concentrated the very traits that threatened it. The consequences of these choices were not always dramatic or immediate, but they were cumulative. A slightly elongated jaw here, a tendency toward frailty there, a subtle predisposition to illness or temperament, Over generations, these small factors became defining features of entire dynasties. Some historians have described it as a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling, a biological echo of centuries of political decision-making. It was quiet, insidious, and inescapable for those trapped within the noble houses. Yet, despite the risks, the system endured. Dynasties survived not because they were genetically ideal, but because they were politically shrewd. Advisors, regents, and the broader machinery of government compensated for any weaknesses, ensuring that power remained in the hands of those who had inherited it. Even flawed rulers could be effective if they had the right networks, the right counselors, and the right ceremonial appearances. Inbreeding created problems, yes, but it did not automatically destroy kingdoms. It simply layered fragility beneath the glittering veneer of authority, making every political crisis potentially more perilous and every succession more fraught. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, these patterns became more visible to observers outside the immediate circles of power. Foreign ambassadors, chroniclers, and visiting dignitaries occasionally commented on the peculiar similarities among rulers from different courts, on the physical quirks that seemed to repeat with uncanny precision. Even so, no one dared explicitly challenge the system. The sanctity of bloodlines remained an unassailable principle, a rule that governed not only the present, but the past and future of European royalty. In private, some monarchs must have understood the cost. They must have recognized that their children's health and abilities were compromised, in part by choices made in previous generations. Perhaps they blamed fate, divine will, or the inevitability of history. Yet, even those who recognized the risk felt trapped. Their own authority, the continuity of their dynasties, and the alliances that ensured their survival depended on adhering to a practice that was quietly eroding the strength of their lineage. The tension between political necessity and biological consequence was one that defined European royalty in ways rarely acknowledged in the annals of history. By the time many of these children reached adulthood, the consequences of centuries of inbreeding became impossible to ignore. Some married and produced heirs who continued the same cycle, unaware that they were inheriting not only a crown, but a cumulative genetic legacy. Others struggled to meet the demands of rulership because their physical or mental capacities had been subtly compromised. The dynastic machine continued to turn, but beneath its polished surface, the repeated patterns of the past were leaving their mark, shaping the very nature of European monarchy in ways that would resonate for generations to come. The 18th century brought with it a quiet intensification of an already entrenched problem. European royalty had been intermarrying for generations, and by now the patterns were so deeply ingrained that they seemed almost natural. No one outside the palace corridors could have imagined the web of relationships that underpinned each throne. Cousins twice removed, uncles married to nieces, granddaughters bound to distant nephews. To an outsider, it might have seemed excessive, even bizarre. But to the courts, it was ordinary, inevitable, and politically necessary. Bloodlines were currency, and the tighter the family tree, the more concentrated the value. And yet, that concentration had consequences. By the time these children reached adolescence, many were exhibiting the subtle signs of inherited traits passed down through repeated loops of familial union. A jawline so pronounced it became almost caricature-like, limbs that were unusually long or oddly jointed, eyes set in ways that suggested a history of close kin unions. But the physical characteristics were only part of the story. There were temperaments to consider, too, moods that swung unpredictably, intelligence and cleverness that sometimes veered into obsession, and personality quirks that were whispered about in the privacy of drawing rooms but never spoken of publicly. Courtiers learned to accommodate these differences. They developed a repertoire of responses and interventions, ranging from careful lesson planning for the intellectually uneven to structured daily routines for the temperamental. Physicians, meanwhile, documented the family's frailties in private ledgers that were never to leave the palace. They used delicate language, constitutional weaknesses, hereditary sensitivity, nervous predispositions, so as not to alarm the monarchs. Publicly, every child was portrayed as perfectly healthy, robust, and airworthy. Behind the velvet curtains, however, reality was more complicated, and the consequences of generations of inbreeding were quietly asserting themselves. Marriage negotiations became increasingly complex as well. The pool of acceptable candidates was shrinking, and the scrutiny placed on every potential union grew more exacting with each generation. Royal families would spend months, sometimes years, examining prospective matches, not only for political advantage, but also for any potential hereditary flaws. These assessments were subtle, often couched in language that only insiders could interpret. She is delicate, but noble, or he is spirited, yet remarkably resilient for his lineage, phrases designed to convey information without admitting what everyone already suspected. It was a delicate balancing act. Marry too closely, and you risked amplifying physical and mental frailties. Marry too distantly, and you risked diluting the bloodline or creating political instability. And so, royal dynasties walked a tightrope of appearances, alliances, and genetic strategy, rarely acknowledging that biology might occasionally demand a compromise they were unwilling to make. The irony was that the very traits they sought to preserve, purity of lineage, continuity of power, visible markers of nobility, were also the traits most likely to weaken them when repeated in close familial unions. Children who grew up under these conditions were acutely aware, even if they could not articulate it. They were expected to be flawless in every public appearance, poised, charming, intelligent, and physically perfect. Private struggles were never discussed outside the family, and sometimes not even within it. Tutors and governesses became de facto counselors, managing emotional and developmental challenges with strategies that were as much about optics as care. Every gesture, every syllable, every posture mattered, because each child was a living emblem of dynastic success or failure. Even kings and queens who understood the risks were constrained by circumstance. By the 18th century, Europe was a continent of entrenched dynasties, each interlinked through decades, if not centuries, of strategic marriages. The political landscape demanded continuity. Rebellions, treaties, and territorial disputes meant that any disruption to the line of succession could have catastrophic consequences. It wasn't enough to consider personal well-being. Monarchs had to consider the stability of entire nations. That meant perpetuating a system that, while risky genetically, provided a veneer of certainty politically. Yet the consequences persisted, quietly accumulating like sediment in a riverbed. Physical peculiarities became more pronounced, subtle frailties more common, and temperamental quirks more frequent. Observers outside the palace began to notice recurring features among ruling families: a distinctive jawline among the Habsburgs, elongated noses in certain branches of French royalty, unusually slender limbs elsewhere. Even foreign dignitaries and ambassadors, often armed with diplomatic tact, occasionally commented on these recurring traits, though always politely and always indirectly. Still, the court itself remained largely in denial. Portraits continued to idealize the subjects, emphasizing nobility and grace, while downplaying or eliminating any visible peculiarities. Written accounts from within the palace often used flattering language to obscure physical and mental challenges. The language of discretion became an art form. Terms like delicate beauty, refined temperament, and thoughtful intensity masked the underlying biological consequences of generations of inbreeding. The children themselves bore the weight of these invisible consequences in both body and mind. Some grew strong and capable, managing to rise above their inherited fragilities, while others struggled silently. Their challenges shaped not only their personal lives, but also their rule. A sickly monarch might rely heavily on advisors, a temperamental one might provoke instability, and an intellectually uneven ruler might make erratic decisions with political consequences. In every case, the interplay between inherited traits and historical circumstance shaped the course of European history in subtle but undeniable ways. As the century advanced, some families began to experiment with slightly more distant marriages, bringing in new blood to strengthen the line. But these efforts were sporadic and often constrained by politics. A foreign alliance might require a carefully chosen spouse who was distant enough to avoid obvious hereditary repetition, yet politically advantageous enough to secure borders, trade, or military support. Even then, the inertia of centuries of intermarriage was hard to overcome. The patterns that had been entrenched for generations continued to manifest, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. What emerged from this period was a paradoxical picture. European royalty was simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than ever. Dynasties controlled vast territories, commanded armies, and influenced entire continents. Yet, beneath the veneer of strength lay a complex web of genetic and psychological vulnerability. The very system that ensured political stability also created weaknesses that could, and sometimes did, have dramatic consequences for those in power. This delicate balance defined the lives of every royal child, every heir, and every reigning monarch in the 18th century. It shaped their health, their personalities, and their capabilities. It dictated marriages, alliances, and succession plans. And it left a legacy that would continue to ripple through European courts for generations to come. A testament to the quiet but profound consequences of centuries of carefully orchestrated bloodline management. The royals moved through this world with a mix of pride, ignorance, and necessity. They were products of a system that demanded purity, yet the very act of maintaining that purity created fragility. They were admired and feared, celebrated and scrutinized, all while carrying the hidden cost of their dynastic choices. And in the private chambers, behind closed doors, the consequences of their ancestors' decisions manifested in ways that shaped not only individual lives, but the destinies of entire nations. By the time the 19th century arrived, the consequences of generations of royal inbreeding were no longer subtle whispers. They had begun to assert themselves in more visible, more undeniable ways. The patterns that had quietly accumulated over centuries were now fully manifest in both the physical features and the temperaments of Europe's most prominent dynasties. To the casual observer, These rulers were as magnificent and imposing as ever, draped in velvet, jewels, and the symbolism of divine right. Yet behind the masks of ceremony and pageantry, the human costs were mounting, hidden beneath carefully curated appearances and meticulously controlled narratives. The children of royal families continued to be born into an environment of expectation and constraint. Every birth was a political event. Every life a potential instrument of alliance or power consolidation. But now, with each successive generation, the inherited vulnerabilities became increasingly apparent. Some children were frail from infancy, struggling to thrive despite the best care that palace resources could provide. Others developed physical features that seemed exaggerated, as if the repeated intermarriages had drawn out certain traits to their extremes. These were not dramatic deformities, as often sensationalized in popular imagination, but subtle, unmistakable markers of concentrated family lines, a protruding jaw, a narrow chest, a delicate skeletal structure, a predisposition towards certain illnesses. Even the mind was not spared. Mental fragility, emotional volatility, and unpredictable temperament became more noticeable. Tutors and governesses learned to adapt, carefully structuring lessons and routines to accommodate their charges' sensitivities. Yet no amount of careful planning could erase the underlying genetic legacy. Children who struggled with focus, memory, or emotional regulation were often labeled as delicate or thoughtful, never as products of a dynasty whose commitment to political continuity had ignored biological risks. Euphemism was a constant companion in these halls, and silence remained the most effective strategy for those who served the royal household. Marriage negotiations continued to be both political and genetic calculations. By now, the options for suitable partners were limited, and every new union required careful scrutiny. Families were acutely aware that marrying too closely risked intensifying inherited weaknesses, while marrying too distantly could compromise political influence or territorial claims. Despite this, the drive to preserve the purity of bloodlines prevailed. Cousins, second cousins, and even uncles and nieces continued to be preferred matches, each union designed to consolidate power, land, and prestige. The delicate balance between politics and genetics became an unspoken obsession, though it was never explicitly acknowledged. The outcomes of these arrangements were visible in rulers across Europe. Some managed to govern effectively, despite physical or mental fragilities, relying heavily on advisors and regents to maintain stability. Others struggled visibly, their personal limitations spilling over into political decisions. An indecisive monarch could delay military campaigns, mismanage finances, or provoke diplomatic tension simply because their inherited constitution left them ill-equipped for the demands of rulership. These weaknesses, though subtle in isolation, compounded over time, creating ripple effects that influenced wars, treaties, and even the survival of entire dynasties. Outside observers began to notice patterns. Foreign diplomats and chroniclers remarked on the recurring physical features across generations, often with a mix of curiosity and polite discretion. Observers noted elongated faces, prominent jaws, narrow shoulders, and other traits that seemed to repeat predictably within families. At the same time, chroniclers commented on behavioral tendencies, melancholy, stubbornness, and temperamental volatility that appeared to follow the same familial lines. These observations were rarely published widely or treated as cautionary tales. They were anecdotal curiosities, curiosities that confirmed the perceived uniqueness of royal blood rather than hinting at its vulnerabilities. Within the palaces, however, the stakes were clear. The physical and mental health of heirs was intimately tied to the stability of kingdoms. A weak child could threaten succession, invite rebellion, or undermine the authority of the reigning monarch. Careful management was essential, from controlling exposure to disease to structuring education to suit individual capacities. Physicians and advisors became masters of discretion, balancing the need to address hereditary weaknesses with the imperative to maintain the public image of perfection. The delicate equilibrium of power required managing both appearances and reality, often simultaneously. Despite these challenges, the ideology of bloodline purity persisted. Monarchs remained committed to marrying within their families, convinced that political and social stability outweighed the risks posed by inbreeding. The cultural and symbolic weight of lineage was immense. A diluted bloodline was seen as a threat to divine favor and dynastic authority. Even when faced with undeniable evidence of inherited frailties, rulers often chose to prioritize tradition and political expedience over biological pragmatism. The human cost, however, continued to mount. Fragile heirs struggled under expectations that were impossible for their bodies and minds to meet. Siblings were compared constantly, their successes and failures meticulously noted by family members and courtiers alike. Even in families renowned for intelligence and accomplishment, subtle vulnerabilities influenced decision-making, leadership style, and interpersonal relationships. These inherited traits, repeated and concentrated over generations, created an undercurrent of instability that often went unacknowledged but was always present. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the consequences of centuries of intermarriage were evident in multiple royal houses across Europe. Certain families became known not only for their political power, but also for their distinctive physical traits and predispositions towards specific health challenges. The Habsburgs, for example, became emblematic of the risks of close-kin unions, their famously pronounced jaws serving as a visible marker of generational repetition. Other dynasties exhibited subtler manifestations, but the principle was the same: inherited traits concentrated over time, creating a legacy that was inextricably intertwined with the history of European monarchy. In the private sphere, the psychological impact was equally significant. Children who were aware of their inherited limitations often developed heightened self-consciousness, anxiety, or a sense of isolation. They were surrounded by wealth, ceremony, and tutors, yet their lived experience was constrained by expectations they could not fully control. Publicly, they were portrayed as embodiments of dynastic pride and perfection. Privately, they navigated the complicated realities of inherited fragility. The tension between public image and private reality became a defining feature of royal life, shaping personalities, decisions, and historical outcomes in ways that historians and contemporaries alike would come to recognize, if only in retrospect. As the 19th century progressed, the interplay between inherited traits and political necessity continued to define European royalty. Dynasties maintained power through careful management of marriages, alliances, and succession, even as the consequences of repeated intermarriage accumulated. The paradox of royal life became increasingly apparent. Families remained powerful and influential, yet their members were biologically and psychologically burdened by decisions made over centuries. The very mechanisms that preserved authority also propagated vulnerability, creating a delicate equilibrium that required constant management. By this point, the lessons of history were increasingly visible, though rarely articulated openly. The repeated physical traits, health vulnerabilities, and behavioral patterns that had emerged over generations offered a cautionary tale. Yet tradition, ideology, and political calculation remained dominant forces, ensuring that the cycle continued. Royal families were both aware of and constrained by the consequences of their choices, living with the inherited costs while projecting an image of invincibility. The legacy of inbreeding was no longer a subtle undercurrent. It had become a defining characteristic of the European monarchy, influencing both individual lives and the broader course of history. By the 19th century, the pattern of intermarriage among European royals had reached a point where its consequences could no longer be ignored, even if they remained officially unspoken. Dynasties that had once prided themselves on their pure bloodlines were now grappling with the subtle but undeniable results of generations of close-kin unions. Physical traits, once seen as markers of noble identity, had become exaggerated. Mental and emotional tendencies, previously dismissed as temperament, were increasingly visible. And yet, the machinery of monarchy ground on, as rigid and implacable as ever, sustained by protocol, ceremony, and the ever-present need to secure power. Royal children in this era were born into worlds of immense expectation. Every gesture, every expression, every minor accomplishment or failure was scrutinized and interpreted in the context of dynastic legacy. A child who struggled to speak clearly was not just a child with a speech impediment. They were a potential heir whose ability to govern might be questioned. A child who displayed exceptional intelligence was celebrated, but only insofar as that intelligence reinforced their suitability for rule. The subtle interplay between biology and expectation created a pressure cooker environment, one in which every royal life was lived under the dual weight of inherited traits and historical obligation. Physical markers of inbreeding, though often mitigated in portraiture, became more apparent in everyday life. The Habsburg jaw, already notorious, remained an unmistakable emblem of the risks inherent in repeated cousin marriages. Other families exhibited elongated limbs, narrow chests, or facial asymmetries that had been quietly amplified over generations. To modern eyes, these traits might seem minor, even trivial, but within the social logic of royal courts, they carried symbolic weight. They were both a badge of dynastic continuity and a subtle signal of inherited vulnerability, a paradox that no one could easily reconcile. Behavioral tendencies mirrored these physical traits. Emotional volatility, pronounced introversion, or unpredictable moods were often attributed to temperament or the weight of royal responsibility, never to inherited predispositions. Tutors, governesses, and physicians developed intricate strategies to manage these tendencies, structuring schedules, lessons, and daily routines to channel energy and emotion in socially acceptable ways. Yet, despite the best efforts of caretakers, the underlying patterns persisted, shaping not only individual personalities, but the ways in which royal children interacted with their environment and, ultimately, how they would govern. Marriage negotiations remained a complex calculus. By now, the pool of suitable partners was tightly constrained. Families needed spouses who were politically advantageous, yet sufficiently unrelated to avoid the most extreme consequences of inbreeding. In practice, these calculations were approximate at best. Royal families often prioritized alliances, dowries, and territorial claims over genetic considerations, even when hereditary weaknesses were increasingly apparent. Political expediency outweighed biological prudence, and as a result, the cycle of repeated intermarriage continued, reinforcing both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of dynastic lines. Some monarchs attempted small adjustments to introduce fresh blood, marrying distant relatives or foreign nobles whose families had not previously been tightly integrated into the royal network. These efforts were inconsistent and often driven more by circumstance than deliberate strategy. Even when executed successfully, they could not reverse the accumulated genetic effects of centuries of close kin unions. The influence of prior generations remained embedded in the lineage, emerging subtly in appearance, health, and temperament. Consequences of these patterns were not merely personal, they shaped governance and politics. Heirs who struggled with health or cognitive challenges often relied heavily on advisors and regents, giving unelected figures significant influence over policy. Emotional instability could affect decision-making, leading to misjudgments in diplomacy or military affairs. Even minor hereditary weaknesses could cascade into significant political consequences, particularly in times of crisis or succession disputes. The fragility imposed by biology intersected with the weight of history, producing outcomes that were as unpredictable as they were consequential. Public perception, meanwhile, remained largely unaltered. Portraits idealized physical form, emphasizing grace and nobility while downplaying imperfections. Chronicles and memoirs celebrated virtues and accomplishments, framing any difficulties as challenges overcome rather than inherited limitations. The mythology of royal invincibility persisted, supported by ritual, ceremony, and careful messaging. Outsiders might notice repeated traits or unusual behaviors, but interpretations were often couched in terms of exoticism or eccentricity rather than heredity. The royal image remained a carefully constructed performance, masking the biological realities that underneath it. Within the private sphere, however, the realities of inherited fragility shaped every aspect of life. Education, play, and socialization were all carefully managed to accommodate physical or mental limitations. Children were isolated in controlled environments, taught to navigate expectations that were often impossible to meet with effort and vigilance. Emotional challenges were managed discreetly, sometimes by tutors, sometimes by extended family members, always under the watchful eyes of attendants who understood the stakes. The pressures of expectation, combined with inherited vulnerabilities, created a psychological landscape in which royal children were acutely aware of their own fragility, even if they could not articulate it. Over time, these pressures produced a duality in royal experience. On one hand, dynasties remained immensely powerful, commanding armies, shaping economies, and influencing culture. On the other hand, individual rulers were increasingly constrained by their inherited predispositions, their personal capacities, intersecting in complex ways with political necessity. Physical frailty, cognitive limitations, or temperamental volatility could limit effectiveness or require compensatory structures, but the dynastic machine continued to function. Monarchies remained resilient, not because individual rulers were flawless, but because the system had evolved to absorb and manage inherited weaknesses, distributing authority in ways that minimized the risks of concentrated fragility. By the mid to late 19th century, observers both within and outside Europe began to recognize patterns that had persisted across centuries. Certain families became emblematic of the consequences of repeated intermarriage. Observers noted both physical features and behavioral tendencies, describing them with a combination of fascination and discreet caution. Some chroniclers hinted at the underlying causes, while others focused on the symbolic or political significance of these traits. Yet, even as these patterns were noted, the broader principles of dynastic continuity remained dominant. Tradition, political calculation, and social expectation continued to dictate marriage practices, ensuring the persistence of inherited patterns even in the face of accumulating evidence. Despite the weight of history, individual agency remained a factor. Some royals attempted to resist the constraints imposed by family and tradition, seeking partners outside the established networks or challenging customary expectations. These efforts were rare and often fraught with risk, as deviation from established norms could threaten alliances, provoke scandal, or undermine claims to power. For most, the path of conformity was unavoidable. The interplay of personal desire, political necessity, and inherited predisposition shaped choices in ways that were both subtle and profound, influencing the course of dynasties, governance, and history itself. In this context, the legacies of centuries of intermarriage were unmistakable. European royalty remained a powerful, dazzling institution, commanding loyalty, awe, and fear. Yet beneath the surface, the cumulative effects of inbreeding shaped the lives, health, and capabilities of those who occupied the thrones. Physical traits, cognitive tendencies, and emotional patterns all bore the marks of hereditary concentration, influencing both private life and public rule. The tension between appearance and reality, tradition and biology, political necessity and human limitation defined the experience of royalty in ways that would resonate for generations. The 19th century thus represented a turning point in the long history of European royal inbreeding. The consequences that had accumulated quietly over centuries were now fully manifest, shaping both the personal and political dimensions of monarchy. Royal families continued to pursue alliances within a constrained pool, navigating a complex interplay of genetic inheritance, political strategy, and social expectation. The patterns established over hundreds of years persisted, ensuring that the dual legacy of power and fragility would continue to define European royalty well into the modern era. By the dawn of the 20th century, European royal families were living testaments to centuries of carefully orchestrated intermarriage. The cumulative effects of repeated cousin unions, uncle-niece marriages, and other close-kin arrangements were now undeniable, etched into the faces, postures, and health of monarchs and heirs alike. What had once been whispered as subtle quirks or charming eccentricities was increasingly evident in both the physical and psychological makeup of the ruling class. And yet, the machinery of monarchy remained remarkably resilient, sustained by the inertia of tradition, the allure of authority, and the practical necessities of governance. Royal children were born into environments shaped by these legacies. Every birth was more than a personal event. It was a political and dynastic calculation. Heirs carried the weight of centuries, tasked with preserving alliances, sustaining legitimacy, and embodying an idealized image of noble perfection. In many cases, their inherited frailties were visible almost from birth. Delicate skeletal structures, pronounced jawlines, narrow chests, or other distinctive physical traits that had become symbolic markers of dynastic continuity. These markers, while often idealized in portraits and public appearances, were tangible reminders of the accumulated consequences of inbreeding. The psychological impact was no less significant. Royal children were acutely aware of their own exceptional status and the expectations it imposed. They were monitored constantly, guided by tutors, governesses, and attendants who understood both the fragility and the symbolic importance of their charges. Emotional regulation, cognitive development, and social skills were all cultivated with careful attention, yet the inherited tendencies persisted, sometimes amplifying stress, anxiety, or unpredictability. Even in the most nurturing environments, the invisible weight of genetic history shaped behavior, decision-making, and personal relationships. Marriage negotiations in this period reflected both continuity and adaptation. Families were increasingly aware that the pool of acceptable partners was limited and that inherited traits could not be ignored entirely. Political advantage remained paramount, but subtle consideration of physical and mental health began to influence decisions more explicitly. Still, the underlying imperative, maintaining dynastic purity, remained dominant. Cousins, distant cousins, and members of allied royal houses continued to be preferred matches, ensuring that the cycle of hereditary concentration persisted. Each marriage represented a careful balance of political expedience and biological pragmatism, though the former often outweighed the latter. Despite these efforts, the consequences of long-term inbreeding were increasingly apparent. Health vulnerabilities, cognitive peculiarities, and emotional instability manifested in ways that could affect governance. Monarchs and heirs who struggled with physical or mental challenges often relied on advisors, regents, or familial councils, shifting power dynamics within the court. Decisions were influenced not only by political considerations, but also by the personal capacities of those who ruled. The fragility imposed by hereditary patterns created both challenges and opportunities, subtly shaping the history of European states and the lives of millions. Observers outside the palace began to notice recurring traits, both physical and behavioral, across different royal houses. Diplomatic reports, foreign memoirs, and social commentaries often remarked on similarities between rulers separated by geography but connected by lineage. Elongated faces, distinctive jawlines, delicate hands, or narrow shoulders were noted, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with polite caution. Behavioral patterns, melancholy, stubbornness, eccentricity, were remarked upon as well. These observations, though often veiled in euphemism or admiration for dynastic uniqueness, pointed unmistakably to the consequences of long-term intermarriage. Yet within the courts themselves, the narrative remained largely unchallenged. Portraits, ceremonies, and public appearances continued to emphasize perfection, authority, and divine favor. Physical quirks were minimized or disguised, emotional and cognitive challenges were managed discreetly, framed as temperament or the weight of responsibility. Royal families maintained a carefully curated image, projecting strength, stability, and superiority to the outside world, while privately navigating the inherited consequences of centuries of close kin unions. The 20th century also brought new pressures. Political instability, wars, revolutions, and the rise of democratic movements challenged the traditional authority of monarchies. Heirs and rulers with inherited vulnerabilities were often ill-equipped to navigate these rapidly changing circumstances, and the tension between dynastic continuity and effective leadership became increasingly acute. Monarchs who had relied on advisors or ceremonial structures now faced environments that demanded personal agility, resilience, and adaptability, qualities that could be compromised by inherited physical or psychological limitations. Despite these challenges, European royal families continued to adapt. The management of health, education, and public image became more sophisticated, incorporating emerging medical knowledge and psychological understanding. Families experimented with introducing more distant partners into marriage arrangements to diversify the gene pool, though such efforts were sporadic and often secondary to political and symbolic concerns. The delicate balance between maintaining dynastic purity and mitigating inherited vulnerabilities persisted, shaping decision-making and influencing the course of history in ways that were subtle but profound. The human cost of this long-term intermarriage remained significant. Royal children grew up under immense pressure, aware of both their elevated status and their inherited fragilities. Physical challenges were managed with medical care and attentive supervision, while emotional and cognitive vulnerabilities were mitigated through careful education and guidance. Still, these inherited traits influenced personality, decision-making, and interpersonal relationships, creating complexities that extended far beyond the personal sphere. The legacies of inbreeding were not merely biological. They were social, political, and psychological, interwoven into the fabric of monarchical life. By the mid-20th century, historians and geneticists began to study the effects of repeated close-kin unions more systematically, often using European royal families as case studies. The patterns were unmistakable: distinctive physical traits, health vulnerabilities, and cognitive or emotional tendencies often clustered within dynasties, reflecting the cumulative effects of generations of intermarriage. These insights provided scientific confirmation of what had long been observable in portraits, memoirs, and historical records. Yet, even with this understanding, the symbolic and political imperatives that had driven intermarriage for centuries remained instructive, revealing the complex interplay between biology, culture, and power. In essence, the 9th chapter of Europe's royal story is one of paradox. Dynasties maintained extraordinary power and influence, despite the persistent consequences of inbreeding. Yet the fragilities that resulted shaped both personal lives and historical events in profound ways. Royalty was simultaneously stronger and weaker than it appeared. Stronger because of political strategy, wealth, and institutional continuity. Weaker because inherited vulnerabilities could subtly undermine leadership, governance, and succession. The interplay between inherited traits and the demands of monarchy created a dynamic that was both fascinating and tragic, a testament to the enduring consequences of centuries-long traditions. Even as the 20th century approached, the lessons of history remained visible in faces, postures, and personalities. Physical markers of inherited traits, subtle vulnerabilities, and behavioral tendencies served as reminders of choices made generations earlier, often in the pursuit of political security and dynastic continuity. Royal families, in their efforts to maintain both authority and image, became living archives of Europe's long, intertwined history, carrying the consequences of intermarriage alongside the weight of power, expectation, and tradition. By the early 20th century, the consequences of centuries of European royal intermarriage had become impossible to ignore, even if the monarchy itself refused to acknowledge them openly. Across the continent, heirs and reigning monarchs bore the subtle marks of concentrated family lines: elongated faces, pronounced jaws, narrow shoulders, delicate hands. Physical manifestations were often complemented by psychological and emotional traits, mood swings, anxiety, cognitive peculiarities that affected not only personal lives, but also the conduct of governance. The very institution that had once been insulated from the messy realities of heredity now carried those realities at its core, wrapped in the rituals, ceremonies, and symbols of monarchy. The younger generations of royals faced immense pressure. They were expected to embody perfection, flawless in appearance, exemplary in behavior, and capable of fulfilling duties they were sometimes biologically predisposed to struggle with. A frail constitution, or inherited temperament, could complicate the daily demands of ruling, attending state functions, and managing familial obligations. Tutors, governesses, and court physicians became critical intermediaries, shaping education, behavior, and health in ways that masked inherited vulnerabilities while preserving the appearance of strength and competence. Behind the gilded walls, these professionals orchestrated lives that were as much about maintaining dynasty as about nurturing the individual child. Marriage negotiations remained a strategic labyrinth, with politics, inheritance, and increasingly visible hereditary traits influencing every decision. Royal families still prioritized alliances that would consolidate power and territory, but the pool of suitable candidates was increasingly narrow. In some cases, families experimented with bringing in partners from more distant lines to dilute inherited traits, yet political imperatives often outweighed biological prudence. The tension between dynastic purity and practical adaptation remained central to decision-making, and the consequences of past intermarriages continued to manifest in physical, mental, and emotional traits that shaped future generations. Physical markers of inbreeding were frequently idealized in portraits or public appearances, creating a visual language that reinforced both identity and continuity. Painstaking attention was given to posture, clothing, and presentation to highlight noble bearing and mask imperfections. Yet subtle signs were often visible to those who observed closely. The distinctive jawlines of the Habsburgs, narrow chests in certain German lines, elongated limbs, or unique facial features elsewhere. These markers, repeated across generations, were the biological signature of intermarriage, a quiet testament to centuries of carefully controlled unions. Emotional and psychological traits also played a significant role in shaping royal life. Children and heirs who struggled with mood regulation, anxiety, or cognitive differences were often carefully guided by tutors and advisors. Daily routines, educational programs, and social interactions were meticulously designed to manage these traits while maintaining appearances. Yet, the underlying hereditary patterns could not be erased. Emotional intensity, volatility, or susceptibility to stress shaped personality, decision-making, and interpersonal relationships, influencing not only individual lives, but the broader operations of governance and diplomacy. Governance itself was subtly shaped by inherited vulnerabilities. Heirs who were frail or temperamental often relied on councils, advisors, and regents to compensate for limitations, transferring influence to unelected officials. Decisions made under stress, cognitive constraints, or emotional instability could have far-reaching consequences for domestic policy, foreign relations, and succession. In some cases, inherited traits contributed to erratic leadership, indecision, or misjudgment, while in others, they prompted greater reliance on collective governance, paradoxically strengthening institutional structures even as individual capacity was limited. Outside observers were not blind to these patterns. Diplomats, foreign dignitaries, and chroniclers frequently remarked on recurring physical traits, behavioral tendencies, or vulnerabilities across dynasties. These observations were often couched in polite euphemism, described as eccentricity, refinement, or uniqueness, yet they pointed unmistakably to the cumulative effects of long-term intermarriage. Foreign commentary, even when subtle, reinforced the idea that European royalty was defined not only by political power, but also by inherited patterns that shaped behavior, appearance, and governance. Despite the visible consequences, royal families continued to adhere to long-standing traditions. Dynastic continuity, political alliances, and social expectation outweighed biological concerns. The ideal of pure royal bloodlines remained central to identity, symbolizing legitimacy, divine favor, and authority. Even as hereditary weaknesses became more apparent, families maintained the cycles of intermarriage, balancing the risks of vulnerability against the perceived benefits of concentrated lineage. The tension between maintaining authority and managing inherited frailty became a defining feature of royal decision-making, influencing marriages, alliances, and succession planning. The psychological burden on royal children was considerable. They were aware of the expectations imposed by ancestry and position, navigating an environment that demanded perfection in appearance, behavior, and competence. Physical frailty, cognitive challenges, or emotional sensitivity could provoke anxiety or self-consciousness, while public scrutiny amplified every perceived shortcoming. Court life required constant vigilance. Every gesture, every word, and every social interaction was observed and interpreted in the context of dynastic legacy. The inherited consequences of intermarriage became a persistent, often invisible pressure, shaping identity and socialization from childhood into adulthood. Medical understanding of hereditary consequences was still developing, but some physicians and advisors began to recognize the patterns with increasing clarity. Notes, correspondence, and private journals sometimes recorded observations about recurring traits, predispositions to illness, or emotional tendencies. Yet these insights rarely translated into public acknowledgement or systemic change. The symbolic and political imperatives of monarchy, authority, legitimacy, and continuity, remained dominant, ensuring that intermarriage practices persisted despite clear evidence of biological consequences. By this period, the human cost of centuries of intermarriage was increasingly evident. Fragile health, behavioral challenges, and subtle cognitive vulnerabilities were compounded by the demands of public life, governance, and dynastic duty. Yet the resilience of royal institutions allowed dynasties to continue functioning, often by distributing responsibility across networks of advisors, ministers, and extended family. Individual limitations were absorbed into larger structures, ensuring continuity even when personal frailties were present. The 20th century thus revealed the paradox of European royalty. Immense political, social, and cultural power coexisted with profound inherited fragilities. Dynasties persisted not because they were biologically ideal, but because they were politically savvy, institutionally resilient, and socially supported. Inherited physical and psychological traits shaped personal lives, governance, and succession, yet did not eliminate authority. The complex interplay between history, tradition, and biology created a dynamic in which vulnerability and power were inseparably intertwined. In essence, this period was defined by continuity and adaptation. Royal families navigated the consequences of centuries of intermarriage while preserving appearances, maintaining political alliances, and managing internal and external pressures. Physical markers of inherited traits persisted, emotional and cognitive challenges were managed discreetly, and marriage practices continued to balance political expedience with biological realities. The interplay between inherited vulnerability and dynastic authority shaped the trajectory of European monarchy, demonstrating that even the most powerful institutions are subject to the subtle but persistent influence of heredity. By the mid-20th century, the legacy of centuries of royal intermarriage had left a complex and often contradictory imprint on Europe's monarchies. Dynasties that once prided themselves on bloodline purity now navigated a landscape shaped by visible inherited traits, subtle vulnerabilities, and evolving societal expectations. The long-term consequences of repeated close-kin unions had become undeniable. Distinctive physical features, health predispositions, cognitive quirks, and emotional volatility were evident across multiple generations. And yet, the institution of monarchy, with its ceremonies, symbols, and political influence, remained remarkably resilient, managing to accommodate these inherited vulnerabilities while projecting continuity and authority. Royal children continued to be born into an intricate web of expectations. Each child carried not only the weight of family legacy, but also the implicit demands of public scrutiny. Physical markers of inherited traits, pronounced jawlines, narrow chests, elongated limbs, were often idealized in portraits or ceremonial appearances, transforming signs of genetic concentration into symbols of dynastic distinction. But these markers, while socially and politically advantageous, also reflected underlying vulnerabilities that could affect health, temperament, and capacity for leadership. Tutors, governesses, and medical advisors became integral in managing these children, crafting carefully controlled routines to nurture abilities, mitigate frailties, and preserve the illusion of perfection. The psychological burden on royal children was profound. From an early age, they were expected to navigate a world where appearances, behavior, and performance were constantly evaluated. Emotional sensitivity, cognitive differences, and physical fragility were often masked or reframed. Mood swings became temperament, developmental challenges became precociousness, and frailty became refinement. The interplay between inherited traits and social expectation created a constant tension, shaping identity, socialization, and interpersonal relationships. In essence, royal children were trained to manage both their inherited vulnerabilities and the immense expectations imposed upon them, balancing the private realities of their biology with the public demands of their station. Marriage negotiations, though increasingly influenced by modern considerations, continue to be dominated by the legacy of inbreeding. Political alliances, territorial considerations, and dynastic continuity remained primary factors, yet families were more attuned than ever to inherited traits and health considerations. Partners were scrutinized for both suitability and compatibility, with subtle attention paid to genetic background, family history, and observable tendencies. Yet, the pool of suitable candidates remained limited by centuries of concentrated intermarriage, reinforcing the patterns that had created both the strengths and vulnerabilities of royal houses. Health remained a central concern. Fragile constitutions, predispositions to disease, and subtle cognitive or emotional vulnerabilities required careful management. Physicians monitored diet, exercise, and medical treatments with precision, often compensating for inherited limitations with careful intervention. Yet, even with modern knowledge and resources, certain hereditary patterns persisted, revealing the enduring influence of centuries of genetic concentration. The monarchy's ability to function despite these vulnerabilities was not evidence of invincibility, but rather a testament to the resilience of its institutions, the sophistication of its caretaking structures, and the strategic management of appearances. The consequences of inherited traits extended into governance and public life. Monarchs or heirs with physical or cognitive challenges often relied heavily on advisors, regents, or councils, creating a diffusion of authority that could both stabilize and complicate decision-making. Emotional volatility or susceptibility to stress could influence diplomacy, military strategy, or domestic policy, while cognitive predispositions might affect judgment and leadership style. The intersection of hereditary traits and institutional structures shaped the course of history, subtly guiding political outcomes while remaining largely invisible to the public eye. Public perception remained carefully managed. Ceremonial appearances, portraits, and media representations emphasized continuity, grace, and strength, masking the underlying vulnerabilities that inheritors of intermarried bloodlines often displayed privately. Chroniclers, journalists, and foreign observers noted unusual traits or recurring patterns, but interpretations were often framed as signs of nobility, refinement, or eccentricity, rather than as consequences of heredity. The monarchy's public image remained a carefully curated performance, designed to reassure subjects, allies, and rivals that the institution remained stable and authoritative, regardless of the private realities of inherited fragility. The interplay between inherited vulnerability and dynastic authority also affected succession. Fragile heirs were often carefully guided, with regents or advisors managing affairs until they were deemed capable of ruling. This created networks of influence that could both stabilize and complicate governance, as power was effectively shared between rulers and intermediaries. In some cases, inherited traits could delay succession, necessitate intervention, or prompt the reconsideration of marriage and alliance strategies. The monarchy's survival depended on a delicate balancing act. managing inherited vulnerabilities while preserving the perception of authority and continuity. Psychological pressures intensified with social modernization. Public scrutiny increased, media attention expanded, and the cultural narrative surrounding royalty evolved. Monarchs and heirs were expected to embody not only dynastic ideals, but also modern values, including emotional intelligence, adaptability, and public engagement. Inherited frailties could complicate these expectations, amplifying the challenges of personal and political life. Yet royal families, with centuries of experience managing inherited traits, adapted their approaches, blending traditional methods with emerging psychological, medical, and social understanding. By mid-century, European royalty had become a paradoxical institution. Dynasties wielded immense cultural, political, and symbolic power, yet the personal capacities of individual rulers were often shaped and constrained by inherited vulnerabilities. Physical, cognitive, and emotional traits influenced behavior, leadership, and decision-making, creating a dynamic where power was maintained not because rulers were biologically ideal, but because institutional structures and social strategies compensated for inherited limitations. The monarchy's resilience was a product of adaptation, strategy, and the careful management of both appearance and reality. The long-term consequences of centuries of intermarriage were visible not only in the physical and psychological traits of individuals, but also in the broader cultural memory of European monarchy. Distinctive features, behaviors, and vulnerabilities became part of the historical narrative, shaping perceptions of royal families, influencing diplomatic relations, and affecting the political trajectory of nations. These legacies were intertwined with the symbolic and institutional power of the monarchy, revealing the complex relationship between biology, history, and social authority. Even in private life, the inherited consequences of intermarriage shaped identity, relationships, and decision-making. Children and heirs navigated a world of expectations and pressures, balancing personal challenges against dynastic duty. Tutors, advisors, and family members mediated these tensions, creating structures to manage inherited vulnerabilities while preserving public appearances. The cumulative effects of centuries of intermarriage became both a burden and a defining characteristic, influencing personality, behavior, and historical outcomes in subtle but profound ways. By the late 20th century, the narrative of European royal intermarriage had become both a subject of historical analysis and a cautionary tale. Genetic patterns, health outcomes, and behavioral tendencies illustrated the consequences of centuries of strategic unions, while the continued resilience of dynastic institutions highlighted the adaptability of monarchy. European royals remained symbols of authority, heritage, and tradition, yet their lived experience was inseparable from the inherited traits that had been amplified over generations. The story of inbreeding was not one of collapse, but of complex negotiation between biology, politics, and culture, a testament to the enduring interplay of human decision, inherited consequence, and historical circumstance. By the late 20th century, the consequences of centuries of European royal intermarriage were no longer confined to whispered observations or private journals. They had become an undeniable, if discreetly managed, aspect of monarchy. The distinctive features and behaviors associated with generations of close-kin unions were apparent in both appearance and temperament, shaping the lives of heirs and reigning monarchs alike. Royal families carried the legacy of their ancestors, not just in titles, territories, or ceremonial roles, but in the very biology that defined each individual. And yet, the institution of monarchy endured, its resilience rooted in centuries of adaptation, strategic planning, and the careful management of appearances. The pressures on royal children were immense. From birth, each child was subjected to scrutiny and expectation: how they looked, how they behaved, how they learned. Physical traits, elongated faces, pronounced jaws, narrow chests, or delicate hands, were often idealized in portraits and public appearances, but they remained visible markers of hereditary concentration. Cognitive and emotional tendencies, anxiety, volatility, sensitivity, or introversion, were similarly framed as refinement or temperament, masking the deeper influence of hereditary patterns. Tutors, governesses, and court advisors orchestrated daily routines with precision, ensuring that children developed along socially acceptable lines, even when biology presented obstacles. Marriage negotiations continued to balance political imperatives with the realities of inherited traits. European royalty had long relied on close kin unions to secure alliances, maintain legitimacy, and consolidate power. Yet, by this period, awareness of the consequences of intermarriage influenced decision-making more consciously. Prospective spouses were scrutinized not only for dynastic suitability, but also for family health history and observable traits. Nevertheless, political expediency often outweighed biological prudence. Dynasties remained committed to the appearance of purity, and the limited pool of acceptable partners ensured that patterns of hereditary concentration persisted. The physical consequences of intermarriage remained visible in the 20th century. Portraits, photographs, and public appearances revealed recurring markers: the pronounced jaws of the Habsburgs, narrow shoulders in certain German lines, elongated limbs, and unique facial structures elsewhere. These markers were not merely cosmetic; they were the biological residue of centuries of strategic unions. To the public, they reinforced the mystique and continuity of the monarchy. To the families themselves, they were subtle reminders of inherited vulnerability, a legacy of choices made by ancestors in the pursuit of power and prestige. Emotional and cognitive patterns similarly influenced royal life. Mood volatility, anxiety, sensitivity, and cognitive quirks were often reframed as refinement, intelligence, or noble temperament. Tutors and advisors developed strategies to manage these traits. Structured education, regimented daily schedules, and careful supervision of social interactions all served to mitigate potential challenges. Yet, despite these measures, inherited tendencies persisted, shaping behavior, decision-making, and interpersonal relationships in ways that were often invisible to the public. The interplay between hereditary vulnerability and social expectation created a complex environment in which personal identity and dynastic duty were inseparable. The consequences of inherited traits extended beyond private life into governance and diplomacy. Monarchs with fragile health, cognitive differences, or emotional sensitivity often relied on advisors or councils, diffusing power in ways that both stabilized and complicated political decision-making. Susceptibility to stress or emotional volatility could influence diplomacy, military strategy, or domestic policy, while cognitive tendencies might affect judgment and leadership style. Inherited vulnerabilities subtly guided the trajectory of nations, shaping history through both direct and indirect influence. Dynastic resilience relied not on individual perfection, but on the capacity of institutions to absorb and compensate for inherited limitations. Public perception remained carefully managed. Photographs, media coverage, and ceremonial appearances emphasized poise, elegance, and authority. The monarchy's image of perfection masked the underlying realities of hereditary consequence. Chroniclers, journalists, and foreign observers occasionally remarked on physical or behavioral patterns, but interpretations were often framed in terms of refinement, uniqueness, or eccentricity. The carefully constructed narrative of invincible royalty persisted, concealing the interplay between biology and history that had shaped each individual ruler. By this point, European royalty had become a paradox, simultaneously powerful and fragile, commanding authority while constrained by hereditary legacies. Dynasties survived and adapted, not because rulers were biologically ideal, but because institutional structures, social networks, and meticulous management mitigated the effects of inherited traits. Monarchs were both products of history and agents of it, their personal capacities shaped by ancestry, even as they influenced the course of nations. The monarchy's resilience was the result of centuries of strategic adaptation, a testament to the interplay between human decision, inherited consequence, and institutional continuity. The psychological burden on royal children was increasingly pronounced. They were expected to perform flawlessly in public while managing private vulnerabilities that were often invisible to outsiders. Anxiety, self-consciousness, and heightened sensitivity were common, yet these traits were rarely acknowledged openly. Court life demanded constant vigilance. Every word, gesture, and appearance was scrutinized, interpreted, and evaluated in the context of dynastic legacy. Tutors, advisors, and family members mediated these pressures, creating environments designed to cultivate resilience while maintaining the illusion of perfection. The inherited consequences of centuries of intermarriage were thus both personal and public, shaping identity and socialization in profound ways. Health management became increasingly sophisticated. Advances in medicine, nutrition, and psychology allowed royal families to better address inherited frailties, yet certain vulnerabilities persisted. Fragile constitutions, predispositions to illness, and subtle cognitive or emotional patterns continued to affect individual behavior and capacity. The monarchy's ability to function despite these challenges reflected not invulnerability, but institutional resilience. Power was distributed, support systems were established, and appearances were carefully curated to preserve authority even when hereditary traits imposed constraints. By the end of the 20th century, the story of European royal intermarriage was a complex blend of biology, politics, and culture. Distinctive physical traits, behavioral patterns, and health predispositions illustrated the long-term consequences of centuries of strategic unions. Dynasties remained powerful and culturally significant, yet the individuals who embodied that power were deeply shaped by inherited vulnerabilities. The monarchy's endurance was a product of adaptation, careful management, and the capacity of institutions to compensate for biological realities. European royalty had become a living archive of history, carrying the consequences of inherited traits alongside the weight of authority, expectation, and tradition. In private and public life alike, the legacies of intermarriage shaped decisions, behaviors, and identities. Physical markers of hereditary concentration, cognitive tendencies, and emotional traits intertwined with political, social, and ceremonial responsibilities, creating a nuanced and often invisible influence on governance. Royal families adapted strategies to manage vulnerabilities, blending medical, educational, and social tools to maintain both personal well-being and institutional authority. The interplay between inherited fragility and dynastic resilience defined the modern experience of monarchy, illustrating the enduring consequences of centuries of intermarriage. By this era, the paradox of European royalty was clear. Immense political, cultural, and symbolic authority coexisted with personal vulnerabilities shaped by ancestry. Dynasties survived and exerted influence not because individual rulers were flawless, but because centuries of institutional knowledge and social management allowed them to navigate inherited weaknesses. The story of inbreeding, of repeated cousin and close kin marriages, had become inseparable from the narrative of monarchy itself, influencing appearance, temperament, governance, and history. European royal families were living embodiments of both human ingenuity and biological consequence, their lives shaped by the intricate interplay of tradition, heredity, and historical circumstance. As the 20th century unfolded, the subtle yet persistent consequences of centuries of royal intermarriage became ever more visible, even as European monarchies navigated unprecedented social, political, and cultural upheaval. The once unquestioned authority of kings and queens was increasingly challenged by democratic movements, revolutions, and the pressures of modernization. Within this shifting landscape, the inherited traits resulting from repeated cousin and close kin unions, physical markers, health vulnerabilities, cognitive quirks, and emotional sensitivities remained embedded in the very fabric of royal families, influencing not only personal lives, but the functioning of monarchy itself. Physical manifestations of long-term intermarriage were evident to anyone who looked closely. The Habsburg jaw, perhaps the most notorious example, remained emblematic of the hereditary concentration of traits, while other dynasties exhibited elongated faces, narrow shoulders, or delicate skeletal structures. These characteristics, while often idealized in portraits or carefully curated public appearances, reflected real biological realities, the cumulative effects of generations of marriages within a limited pool of noble bloodlines. To the public, such features reinforced the aura of distinction and refinement. Within the family, they were subtle reminders of vulnerability, an inheritance that could influence health, stamina, and longevity. Emotional and cognitive traits were equally pronounced, though less visible. Anxiety, mood instability, sensitivity, and particular cognitive tendencies were often reframed as refinement, intelligence, or noble temperament, masking the influence of hereditary patterns. Royal children were meticulously managed, with tutors, governesses, and advisors orchestrating education, socialization, and daily routines to cultivate resilience while preserving the appearance of perfection. Yet, despite these efforts, inherited tendencies persisted, shaping decision-making, relationships, and social interaction. The interplay between biology and expectation created a life of constant negotiation, where personal identity was inseparable from dynastic duty. Marriage negotiations continued to reflect this duality of political necessity and biological consideration. While political alliances, territorial consolidation, and legitimacy remained paramount, there was growing awareness of inherited traits and health risks. Prospective spouses were evaluated for genetic history and observable characteristics, yet dynastic priorities often superseded biological prudence. The limited pool of acceptable candidates, a product of centuries of intermarriage, ensured that patterns of hereditary concentration persisted, even as families sought to introduce occasional fresh blood to diversify traits. The tension between maintaining lineage purity and mitigating hereditary vulnerability defined royal marriage strategy well into the modern era. Health management became increasingly sophisticated. Physicians, psychologists, and caretakers developed tailored strategies to address inherited vulnerabilities, from diet and exercise to mental health support and structured routines. Fragile constitutions, predispositions to illness, and subtle cognitive or emotional patterns required constant monitoring, yet many traits were immutable, products of centuries of accumulated ancestry. The monarchy's resilience did not stem from invulnerability, but from the ability to manage these inherited challenges effectively, combining institutional support with careful presentation to sustain authority and continuity. The consequences of hereditary patterns extended beyond personal health into governance. Monarchs with cognitive or emotional vulnerabilities often relied heavily on advisors or councils, distributing authority in ways that could both stabilize and complicate decision-making. Emotional sensitivity could affect diplomacy, negotiations, and domestic policy, while cognitive predispositions could shape strategy, judgment, and leadership style. In this sense, hereditary traits were not merely private matters. They influenced the direction of states, the outcome of decisions, and the experience of citizens, subtly guiding history through mechanisms that were often invisible but profoundly consequential. Public perception remained carefully managed. Photographs, ceremonial appearances, media coverage, and biographies emphasized elegance, poise, and authority. Chroniclers and observers noted recurring physical or behavioral patterns, but often framed them as refinement, sophistication, or eccentricity rather than hereditary consequence. This careful curation of image allowed monarchies to maintain public confidence while quietly navigating the biological realities of inherited vulnerabilities. The contrast between appearance and underlying reality became a defining feature of royal life, shaping both personal experience and public understanding. By mid-century, the paradox of European royalty was stark. Dynasties maintained cultural, political, and symbolic authority, while individual rulers were often shaped and constrained by inherited vulnerabilities. The monarchy's continued influence relied on institutional structures, strategic management, and social adaptation, rather than the innate perfection of its members. Physical, cognitive, and emotional traits, accumulated over generations of intermarriage, created a complex landscape in which authority and fragility coexisted, shaping the contours of monarchy in subtle but persistent ways. The psychological impact on royal children and heirs remained profound. The expectations placed upon them, perfection in appearance, behavior, and capacity, were amplified by public scrutiny and familial legacy. Emotional intensity, Cognitive predispositions and physical frailty were managed through structured routines and careful guidance, yet the pressure of inherited consequence weighed heavily. Court life demanded constant vigilance, as every action, word, and gesture was interpreted in the context of dynastic continuity. Personal identity, performance, and duty were intertwined, creating a life of intense negotiation between inherited limitations and the demands of monarchy. Advances in medical knowledge allowed royal families to manage some hereditary risks more effectively, but many traits persisted, reflecting the accumulated effects of generations of strategic intermarriage. Genetic predispositions, physical markers, cognitive tendencies, and emotional traits continued to shape behavior, decision-making, and health outcomes. Monarchies adapted by distributing responsibilities, enhancing support systems, and carefully curating public image, ensuring continuity despite the presence of inherited vulnerabilities. As Europe moved into the latter half of the 20th century, the visibility of hereditary consequence combined with the pressures of modernization to redefine the experience of monarchy. Royal families navigated a world increasingly shaped by democratic ideals, media scrutiny, and cultural change, yet they remained custodians of centuries-old traditions, symbols, and institutions. The tension between inherited fragility and institutional resilience became increasingly apparent, revealing the complex interplay of biology, history, and power. By this time, the story of intermarriage was no longer only about dynastic strategy. It was a narrative of adaptation, survival, and negotiation. Royal families balanced the demands of heritage with the realities of inherited traits, managing both physical and psychological vulnerabilities while maintaining authority and influence. The interplay of tradition, politics, and biology shaped decisions about marriage, succession, governance, and public image, creating a web of influence in which each individual's inherited characteristics had consequences for families, states, and societies. In essence, the history of European royal intermarriage was one of enduring paradox. Dynasties wielded immense cultural, political, and symbolic power, yet their members were often constrained by inherited vulnerabilities. Monarchies survived and thrived not because rulers were biologically ideal, but because centuries of institutional knowledge, strategic management, and social adaptation compensated for inherited limitations. Physical features, emotional tendencies, and cognitive patterns shaped both private lives and public outcomes, creating a complex interplay of heredity, authority, and history that defined European monarchy in the 20th century and beyond. Even in private life, these inherited traits influenced personality, behavior, and decision-making. Royal children and heirs navigated a world where public expectation and biological reality were inseparable, balancing fragility with duty and vulnerability with authority. Tutors, advisors, and family members orchestrated lives to cultivate resilience while maintaining appearances, creating structures that compensated for hereditary traits. The legacy of centuries of intermarriage was thus both personal and institutional, shaping individual lives while reinforcing the enduring power of monarchy. By the dawn of the 21st century, the long shadow of centuries of intermarriage cast itself quietly across European royalty. The consequences of repeated cousin unions, uncle-niece marriages, and alliances carefully curated to consolidate power were now fully visible, both in physical form and psychological disposition. Yet these families had survived, adapted, and evolved, demonstrating a resilience that often went unacknowledged in the public eye. The story of hereditary consequence was, paradoxically, also a story of enduring authority, meticulously managed appearances, and the unbroken thread of dynastic continuity. The physical legacy of inbreeding remained unmistakable in many royal lines. Prominent jawlines, narrow chests, elongated facial structures, and other subtle markers were repeated across generations, each a testament to the concentrated lineage carefully maintained over centuries. Portraits, photographs, and public appearances often disguised or idealized these traits, turning them into symbols of refinement, nobility, or uniqueness. Yet, beneath the carefully crafted image lay the biological reality of a lineage constrained by generations of strategic union, a reminder that the appearance of perfection often masked inherited vulnerability. Psychological and emotional traits were similarly influenced. Anxiety, mood volatility, hypersensitivity, and cognitive quirks were reframed as temperament, intelligence, or noble character. Tutors, governesses, and advisors had, for centuries, created environments designed to manage these tendencies, imposing strict schedules, guided education, and carefully orchestrated socialization. Yet inherited traits persisted, shaping decision-making, social interaction, and personal identity. Royal children and heirs grew up under intense scrutiny, expected to embody both dynastic legacy and personal excellence, all while navigating inherited vulnerabilities they could neither fully understand nor control. Marriage practices, though modernized in some respects, remained deeply rooted in tradition. Dynastic alliances continued to be prioritized, ensuring political and territorial consolidation. Yet, there was growing awareness of hereditary consequences, with family histories, health predispositions, and observed traits factored into marital negotiations. Despite this awareness, the limited pool of suitable partners meant that intermarriage patterns persisted, albeit more consciously managed. Dynasties faced a delicate balancing act, maintaining bloodline continuity while mitigating risks that centuries of concentrated unions had amplified. Health management evolved with advances in medicine and psychology. Fragile constitutions, cognitive peculiarities, and emotional sensitivities were addressed with tailored interventions, from specialized medical care to structured educational and social support. But certain vulnerabilities, particularly those deeply rooted in hereditary patterns, were immutable. Monarchies survived not because rulers were biologically ideal, but because systems were designed to absorb and compensate for inherited limitations. Advisors, regents, and extended family networks functioned as buffers, maintaining continuity, authority, and effective governance despite individual fragilities. The influence of inherited traits extended beyond personal health and into the broader realm of governance. Emotional intensity or volatility could subtly shape diplomatic negotiations, military strategy, and domestic policy. Cognitive tendencies could influence judgment, decision-making, and leadership style. The diffusion of authority, often mediated through advisors or councils, was both a response to hereditary vulnerabilities and a mechanism for maintaining stability. Monarchies remained functional and influential because their institutions had evolved to manage the human limitations embedded within them, a living testament to centuries of adaptation. Public perception remained central to the monarchy's enduring power. Media coverage, ceremonial appearances, and historical narratives emphasized elegance, authority, and continuity, masking the subtler realities of hereditary consequence. Chroniclers, journalists, and observers often remarked on distinctive traits or behaviors, framing them as refinement, sophistication, or even eccentricity. The careful curation of image ensured that royal families remained symbols of stability, lineage, and authority, even as private realities reflected the inherited fragilities of centuries-long intermarriage. The psychological pressures on royal heirs were profound. The constant expectation of perfection, combined with inherited vulnerabilities, created intense personal and emotional challenges. Children and young heirs were acutely aware of scrutiny, navigating an environment where every word, gesture, and appearance was evaluated. Emotional regulation, cognitive performance, and social aptitude were cultivated meticulously, yet inherited predispositions remained a persistent influence. The life of a royal child was therefore a balancing act, where the weight of ancestry and the demands of duty shaped identity, behavior, and worldview from the earliest years. Advances in genetics and historical analysis have since illuminated the scope of inherited consequences across European royalty. Patterns of physical traits, health vulnerabilities, and behavioral tendencies can now be traced with remarkable clarity, revealing the complex interplay of heredity and human decision over centuries. The concentrated lineage that once ensured political alliances and territorial security also embedded vulnerabilities that manifested in subtle but profound ways, influencing individual lives, dynastic strategies, and historical trajectories. Despite these inherited challenges, the monarchy endured. Institutions adapted, protocols evolved, and family networks became more sophisticated in managing both appearance and reality. Authority was maintained through careful orchestration, with inherited vulnerabilities mitigated by structural, social, and medical interventions. Monarchs remained symbols of continuity and legitimacy, even when personal capacities were constrained by hereditary factors. The coexistence of power and fragility became a defining characteristic of European royalty, a testament to both human ingenuity and the enduring influence of ancestry. The legacy of centuries of intermarriage is evident not only in the physical and psychological makeup of individuals, but also in the cultural memory of European monarchy. Portraits, biographies, and historical accounts preserve the narrative of refinement, authority, and power, while quietly hinting at the consequences of concentrated lineage. Royal families became living archives of genetic history, carrying forward the traits, strengths, and vulnerabilities of generations past, demonstrating that the personal and the political are inextricably intertwined. Ultimately, the story of European royal inbreeding is one of paradox and resilience. Dynasties retained immense authority, wealth, and symbolic power, yet their members were often shaped and constrained by inherited vulnerabilities. Monarchies survived and evolved not because rulers were flawless, but because institutions were designed to accommodate, manage, and compensate for human limitation. Physical traits, emotional patterns, and cognitive tendencies shaped the lives of heirs and rulers, influencing personal experiences, governance, and historical outcomes. Yet, the monarchy endured, a testament to the intricate dance between biology, tradition, and power. In the 21st century, these legacies continue to resonate. European royalty remains a symbol of history, continuity, and cultural identity, carrying the subtle imprint of centuries of intermarriage. Physical characteristics, behavioral patterns, and hereditary predispositions are now often discussed with curiosity or scientific interest rather than secrecy, reflecting both public fascination and scholarly insight. The enduring paradox is clear. The monarchy persists, resilient and authoritative, yet its members remain living embodiments of the biological, psychological, and historical consequences of a tradition that prioritized lineage above all else. Through every era, from medieval courts to modern palaces, the story of inbreeding, inheritance, and dynastic strategy illustrates the complex interplay of power, biology, and human agency. It is a story of adaptation, survival, and negotiation, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions are subject to the subtle but persistent forces of heredity. European royalty, in all its ceremonial grandeur and historical significance, is ultimately both a triumph and a cautionary tale, a living monument to the enduring consequences of choices made generations ago in pursuit of power, legitimacy, and continuity.